The wealthy businessman adjusts his expensive suit and sneers at the elderly woman sitting alone at the back table. "Excuse me, but this is a high-class wedding reception, not a charity dinner for homeless people who wandered in off the street." 84-year-old Colonel Sarah Steele Hawk, Washington, quietly smooths her simple dress as other guests turn to stare and whisper, completely unaware that the humble woman before them once led the most dangerous rescue missions in military history and personally saved over 300 American soldiers from enemy territory. This story will absolutely blow your mind and show you why you should never judge someone by appearance alone. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments, have you ever seen someone's assumptions completely backfire? What happens next will silence this entire wedding reception. Colonel Sarah Washington had been looking forward to her nephew's wedding for months. At 84, she didn't get many opportunities to celebrate with family, and seeing young Michael marry his college sweetheart brought her genuine joy. She had driven 4 hours from her small apartment to attend the reception at the luxurious Grandview Manor. Sarah wore her best dress, a simple navy blue outfit she had owned for 15 years, and carried a modest purse that contained the $50 she could afford as a wedding gift. Her appearance was humble, but her presence radiated the quiet dignity that came from a lifetime of service and sacrifice. The wedding reception was clearly an expensive affair, filled with wealthy guests and designer clothing and expensive jewelry. Michael's new in-laws were successful business owners who had spared no expense for their daughter's special day. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and each table was decorated with elaborate floral arrangements that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly pension. Sarah had been seated at table 12 in the back corner, away from the main festivities. She didn't mind the placement. She was simply grateful to be included in her nephew's celebration and enjoyed watching the young couple's happiness from her quiet spot. The trouble began when wealthy businessman Richard Blackwell noticed Sarah sitting alone. Richard owned a chain of luxury car dealerships and was used to being surrounded by affluent people at high-end social events. Sarah's modest appearance and solitary position caught his attention for all the wrong reasons. Richard had been drinking champagne and showing off for his business associates when he spotted what he considered an inappropriate guest. He made loud comments about the declining standards of wedding receptions, ensuring his voice carried to nearby tables. "I can't believe they let just anyone into these events nowadays," Richard announced to his table mates. "Look at that woman over there. She looks like she picked her outfit from a thrift store. This is supposed to be an elegant affair." His wife Margaret, equally pretentious and concerned about appearances, followed his gaze to Sarah's table. "Oh my goodness," she whispered loudly, "she doesn't belong here at all. Someone should ask her to leave before she embarrasses the bride and groom." Other guests began turning to look at Sarah, who was quietly eating her dinner and trying to stay invisible. The whispers and stares made her uncomfortable, but she had endured worse during her military career and maintained her composure. Richard decided to take matters into his own hands. He stood up from his table and walked across the reception hall with obvious purpose, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor as other guests watched the drama unfold. "Excuse me," Richard said loudly as he approached Sarah's table, "but I think there's been some kind of mistake. This is a private wedding reception for invited guests only, not a community dinner for people who need a free meal." Sarah looked up at him with calm eyes that had seen combat in 3 different war zones. "Sir," she said quietly, "I'm Michael's aunt. I was invited to celebrate his wedding." Richard laughed condescendingly and shook his head. "Listen, lady, I don't know what story you told to get in here, but this is a high-class event. Look around. Everyone here is dressed appropriately for an elegant celebration. You're clearly in the wrong place." The conversation was attracting more attention as guests stopped dancing and chatting to watch the confrontation. Sarah felt the familiar sting of judgment based on appearances. something she had faced countless times as a woman in the military. Young man, Sarah replied with dignity, I understand this is a beautiful celebration. I'm simply here to support my family and wish the couple well. But Richard wasn't satisfied with her explanation. He wanted to make sure everyone understood that he was protecting the integrity of this upscale social gathering. AM, Richard said. In a patronizing tone, I'm sure you're a nice person, but you're making the other guests uncomfortable. This reception cost over $50,000, and we can't have people who don't understand proper etiquette disrupting the celebration. Margaret had joined her husband, along with several other wealthy guests who felt entitled to police the guest list. They formed a small group around Sarah's table, making her feel surrounded and isolated. Maybe she's confused about which event she's supposed to attend, Margaret suggested loudly. There might be a church dinner or community gathering somewhere else that would be more appropriate for her. A younger businessman named Travis, eager to impress Richard with his support, added his own cruel observation. She probably saw all the expensive cars outside and thought she could get a free meal. These people have no shame about taking advantage of generous families. Sarah's hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the effort it took to remain calm in the face of such public humiliation. She had led soldiers through enemy fire, made life-or-death decisions in combat zones, and commanded respect from the toughest warriors in the military. But facing this social cruelty felt different and more personal. The bride and groom were across the room cutting their cake, unaware that Sarah was being harassed by guests who felt superior based on wealth and appearance. Other family members were busy with reception activities and hadn't noticed the confrontation developing in the back corner. Richard decided to escalate the situation, wanting to make his point clear to everyone watching. I'm going to have to ask you to leave, he announced loudly enough for half the reception to hear. You're disrupting our celebration, and frankly, you don't belong here with decent people. The circle of wealthy guests murmured their agreement, feeling justified in their actions. They saw themselves as protecting the wedding's elegance and maintaining appropriate social standards. Sarah slowly stood up from her chair, maintaining the perfect posture that decades of military service had ingrained in her. She was preparing to leave quietly rather than cause a scene at her nephew's wedding, even though the treatment was deeply hurtful. That's when a voice from across the room cut through the confrontation like a sword. What the hell is going on over there? Everyone turned to see a distinguished man in his 70s, striding across the reception hall with obvious authority and growing anger. General Robert Hayes was the bride's grandfather, a decorated military officer who had been mingling with guests near the head table. General Hayes had been watching the confrontation develop from across the room, and something about the elderly woman's bearing and dignity looked familiar. As he got closer and saw her face clearly, recognition hit him like lightning. The general pushed through the circle of wealthy guests surrounding Sarah's table, his military bearing commanding immediate respect from everyone present. His face showed a mixture of disbelief and outrage as he realized what was happening. Colonel Washington? General Hayes said with amazement and growing anger. Sarah Steele Hawk Washington? Sarah's eyes widened with surprise and relief as she recognized her former commanding officer. General Hayes, she replied with genuine warmth. It's wonderful to see you again, Sir. The transformation in the reception hall was immediate and electric. General Hayes snapped to attention and rendered a perfect military salute that every guest could see, his voice carrying throughout the now silent room. Ladies and gentlemen, General Hayes announced with authority that commanded attention from every person present. You are in the presence of one of the greatest heroes in United States military history. Richard's confident expression began to crumble as he realized something significant was happening. The wealthy businessman who had been so quick to judge and dismiss Sarah now found himself facing a decorated general who was treating the humble woman with obvious reverence. Colonel Sarah Washington led more successful rescue missions than any officer in modern military history. General Hayes continued with pride resonating in every word. She personally saved over 300 American soldiers from enemy territory and never lost a single person under her command. The reception hall fell completely silent, except for the sound of Richard's heavy breathing as the magnitude of his mistake became clear. Margaret and Travis, who had been so eager to support the harassment, now looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. General Hayes wasn't finished with his revelation. He turned to address Richard directly, his voice taking on the sharp edge that had once commanded troops in the most dangerous combat zones. This woman flew helicopter rescue missions in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. She has more medals for valor than most soldiers ever see, and she earned every one of them by risking her life to save others. The circle of wealthy guests who had been surrounding Sarah's table began backing away, suddenly realizing they had made a terrible mistake. Other reception guests were gathering around to witness this extraordinary moment, but General Hayes had more to reveal about the woman they had been treating with such contempt and cruelty. Colonel Washington was the first woman ever selected for our most elite rescue operations unit. She holds records for successful missions that still stand today, and she's personally responsible for more American soldiers coming home alive than anyone else in her generation. Sarah stood quietly beside her former commanding officer, overwhelmed by the unexpected recognition and defense. She had never sought attention for her military service, preferring to live quietly and let her actions speak for themselves. Richard realized his social standing and business reputation were facing a disaster of epic proportions. He approached Sarah with obvious panic and desperation in his voice. "Ma'am," Richard stammered, "I had absolutely no idea about your service. I am deeply sorry for my behavior and comments. Please accept my most sincere apologies." But Sarah's response demonstrated the grace and dignity that had made her such an effective leader throughout her military career. "Sir," Sarah said calmly, "I hope this experience teaches you not to judge people based on their appearance or financial situation. Everyone deserves basic respect and courtesy." General Hayes spent the next hour sharing stories about Sarah's incredible career with fascinated wedding guests. He described missions where she had flown into enemy territory under heavy fire to rescue wounded soldiers, often against direct orders and at tremendous personal risk. The bride and groom, learning about their remarkable relative for the first time, asked Sarah to join them at the head table for the rest of the reception. Other guests lined up to meet her and hear stories about her legendary military service. Margaret approached with tears in her eyes and genuine shame in her voice. "Colonel Washington," she said, "I am so ashamed of my behavior tonight. Thank you for your service, and please forgive my terrible judgment." Travis, the young businessman who had made cruel assumptions, waited respectfully for his chance to apologize. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I was completely wrong, and I've learned an important lesson about respect and assumptions." The wedding reception that had started with Sarah being humiliated and excluded ended with her being honored as the guest of honor. The bride and groom insisted on taking photos with their heroic aunt, and many guests asked for her contact information to learn more about her incredible story. As the evening wound down, General Hayes walked Sarah to her car, still amazed at the coincidence of finding his former colleague at his granddaughter's wedding. "Steel Hawk," he said using her old call sign, "some things never change. You're still showing people what real class and dignity look like, even when they don't deserve it." Sarah Washington drove home that night, not as a charity case who had been judged and found wanting, but as the honored veteran and genuine hero she had always been. The wealthy guests who had been so quick to judge learned that true worth has nothing to do with expensive clothes or bank account balances. The story of what happened at the Grandview Manor reception spread quickly through both military and social circles. Richard Blackwell's reputation never fully recovered from the incident, while Sarah found herself with invitations to speak at military events and recognition ceremonies across the country. But most importantly, everyone who witnessed that night learned that heroism often comes in humble packages, and that the quiet person sitting in the corner might have stories of courage and sacrifice that could humble the proudest and wealthiest among us.